Imagine maxing out every credit card you have, then lending yourself the money to pay them off, as if you could just print that money out of thin air. It sounds absurd, but this is roughly how the United States finances itself. It borrows by issuing bonds. Then, through its own central bank, it buys a chunk of those same bonds with money created from nothing. On paper, it looks like the US is paying itself with money it doesn't have. In reality, it is the biggest financial trick in the world, and you pay the price. Your job, your house price, your savings, even the stability of your currency, all sit on the assumption that this machine can run forever. Right now, in 2025, this bond trick is being pushed harder than ever. It is the reason a government with more than $34 trillion in debt can keep swiping the card and never see transaction declined. The question is not whether the trick works. It is how long it can run before the system snaps. To understand this trick, we need to start with the basics. A government bond is simply an IOU. The U.S. Treasury asks for money today and promises to repay it with interest on a specific date. Investors treat these IOUs as the safest asset in the system because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, the belief that America will raise taxes, cut spending, or create new money before it allows a default. Well, that trust lets the government keep finding lenders even when it spends more than it collects in taxes. Whenever there is a gap between spending and revenue, the Treasury holds an auction and offers bonds with different repayment dates. Banks, funds, and foreign governments bid to lend and lock in a predictable return. So far, it looks like ordinary borrowing, a scaled-up version of you taking a loan to cover a shortfall. Nothing magical yet, just IOUs changing hands. But here is where it stops looking like your household budget. The twist is that there is a buyer who does not need to save first, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank. In practice, the Treasury sells bonds to investors. Then later, the Fed buys some of those same bonds from them and pays with dollars it has created electronically. The bonds move onto the Fed's balance sheet, and the new money flows into the financial system. It is like a company printing its own gift cards, selling them to customers, then quietly buying some back and counting both the cards and the cash as part of its wealth. The market still looks like a normal trade in safe assets, but more and more government debt is financed with money that exists only because the state chose to support its own IOUs. Put simply, the government writes itself a promise, has its own bank bless it, and the whole world treats that promise as solid money. That self-funded loop is the bond trick, and it tends to unfold in stages. First, spending more than you earn becomes normal policy, not an emergency move. Picture the bond trick as a habit that gradually hardens over time. Second, that gap is bundled into new government IOUs. Third, the central bank stops being an occasional buyer and turns into a regular heavy customer for that debt. Fourth, the new money it pumps in to keep that market calm makes credit cheaper and pushes asset prices up, so the boom feels like real strength. By this point, the trick is no longer a bandage, it has become the engine of the boom. Fifth, the whole financial system starts to rely on low interest rates and easy refinancing just to function. Sixth, foreign investors, who once treated that debt as unquestionable safety, start to trim their exposure. Seventh, if belief really weakens, borrowing costs jump, and the same setup that once held everything together starts to shake it apart. The modern version of this story began when the dollar was still tied to gold. Call this the first act, the age when money still had a visible anchor. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created in a world where each dollar was supposed to match a fixed amount of metal. That rule was simple. If the government wanted a big war or a bigger footprint overseas, it had to find real money from taxpayers or from savers first. Then World War I hit. The bills outgrew the gold in the vault. America sold a huge amount of debt, and when private buyers could not take it all, the new central bank stepped in, bought some of it, and pushed extra money into the banking system. That mix, large borrowing plus quiet central bank support, did not vanish when the peace treaties were signed. Debt markets became a permanent tool for raising resources without matching them with equally large tax hikes. And that is why, long after the guns went silent, the habit of leaning on bonds instead of taxes stayed in place. Britain walked a similar path, using war borrowing and its own central bank through two global conflicts. For a while, its money was treated as almost the final backstop. Over time, repeated strains cut it down to the level of an ordinary national currency. This is where the spotlight moves. The United States moved the other way and became the main issuer the world leaned on. In the 1940s, another world war sent American spending and debt to levels nobody had seen before. To keep the interest bill under control, the Fed made a key choice. It held down government borrowing costs by stepping in whenever needed, so the Treasury could keep issuing IOUs at low rates, helping the debt market stop being a one-off crisis move and turned into a standard policy lever, with the central bank actively managing what the state paid to borrow. In simple terms, the referee started quietly rigging the price of its own debt. After the war, prices rose and the formal deal was adjusted, but the habit remained. In serious trouble, the Fed would again act as a buyer of government bonds to steady the system. In 1971, the last formal link between the dollar and gold was cut when America stopped swapping foreign dollar claims for metal. From then on, the value of the currency rested on trust in future dollars, and government IOUs became promises to pay in something the issuer could create in unlimited amounts. That change removed the old hard cap on how far debt could grow. What happens to discipline when the limit disappears but the habit of borrowing remains? In the decades that followed, U.S. securities turned into the favorite reserve and collateral for banks, pension funds, and foreign central banks. The belief that the main reserve currency would not be allowed to fail turned American deficits into a kind of global product, something others bought as savings and used to back their own lending. By the 1980s and 1990s, this debt-based setup sat quietly behind most major financial choices, and every new scare led to the same question: how far would the Fed go to support this market? In 2008, when house prices rolled over and big institutions began to crack, the answer went to a new level. The Fed launched quantitative easing, not just nudging short-term rates, but buying huge amounts of government debt directly with money it had just created. As its holdings grew, borrowing costs dropped, mortgages got cheaper, and stock prices found a floor. The panic was stopped, but the system's reliance on this method deepened, and what started as one tool among many became the go-to response whenever the structure looked like it might fail. From then on, every crisis was a test of nerves, not of savings, because everyone had seen how far the money machine could go. From that crisis on, markets learned a simple rule: if things get ugly, the cure will just get bigger. More borrowing, more bond buying, more new money. In other words, the worse the fire looks, the more fuel the firefighters promise to pour on. You see it most clearly on the ground. In one house, a couple who bought in 2006 watches their street fill with foreclosure signs. Their home is worth less. Their jobs feel shaky. They hear words like liquidity and credit crunch. But what they really feel is this: the mortgage that once felt like a ladder now feels like a cliff. In another house, a fund manager is glued to the same news. He is not listening for the human drama. He is listening for one line: the Fed will buy more bonds. To him, that means cheaper borrowing, rising asset prices, and another chance to load up and ride the next wave. One policy, two realities. The pain is softened for people who already own a lot of assets and use a lot of borrowed money. Everyone else takes the hit through lost jobs, lost equity, and later, higher prices. That is how this setup quietly chooses winners, not just saves the system. As this pattern repeats, borrowing to fill holes stops being a last resort and becomes the default setting. In just over a decade, federal debt moves from the low tens of trillions into the 30s, and the interest bill turns into one of the biggest lines in the budget. The tab is no longer a background number. It is one of the main stories in the room. Yet the world still lines up to buy new bonds, because big players believe that if things get bad enough, the central bank will step in as the buyer that never runs out of cash. Bit by bit, the prices that shape everyday life, mortgage rates, company loans, even the value of pensions, start to assume that support will always be there. You end up with a system that needs low interest rates just to stand up, while the pile of IOUs keeping those rates low keeps growing. This is where the story stops being just about spreadsheets and starts being about faith. At that point, belief matters as much as math. To you as a saver, a treasury bond looks like a safe place to park cash. To central bankers and finance ministers, that same bond is a lever, something they can push or pull to move borrowing costs for the whole economy. When they buy a lot of bonds, prices go up and yields drop. Cheaper yields invite more borrowing. More borrowing makes the whole structure more fragile and more dependent on keeping yields from rising too far. It is the system trying to hold itself up by buying more of its own promises and calling the calm proof that everything is fine. The more often that move is used, the more it changes who gets ahead. New money does not fall evenly from the sky. It enters through banks, markets, and big institutions. They see it first. They can borrow cheaply and buy assets before prices fully adjust. Most households live on wages and small pools of savings. They feel the shift later, in rent that jumps, in food and health care that cost more, and in pay that struggles to keep up. Over years, that timing gap becomes a wealth gap. The same machine that props up markets also funnels the biggest gains toward those parked closest to the source of new money. Now watch what this does to politics. Politics bends around this reality too. If every big project had to be matched with clear tax hikes or obvious spending cuts, voters would feel the weight of each decision immediately. But if leaders can sell bonds instead, and know that their own central bank can hold a lot of that paper, the pressure eases. Stimulus plans, rescue packages, long wars, all can be put on the tab and rolled into the future rather than paid for in full today. The real bill arrives later, in money that buys less, in weaker growth, and in a currency that carries more strain, long after the press conferences and campaign speeches have ended. Zoom out, because the same trick does not stop at the water's edge. The same pattern stretches beyond one country's borders. When nations earn more dollars than they spend right away, they rarely leave that cash just sitting there. They park a lot of it in very liquid U.S. assets, mainly government bonds, to earn interest and to have something they can use in a crisis. In practice, exporters send out cars, machines, oil and grain, and receive digital dollar balances in return. A chunk of those balances is recycled into U.S. IOUs. America uses the proceeds to cover its gaps. Those dollars then flow back out again through imports, foreign bases, aid, and investment. Over time, that loop has built a web of trade and reserves around the same core mechanism. One country's debt has become both its own lifeline and the safety cushion other countries keep for themselves. But when everyone is tied to the same lifeline, what happens if it ever starts to fray? On top of that global loop, there's another layer. Those promises to pay dollars in the future pile up in two big places, in foreign reserves and on the Fed's own books. Over the mid-2000s and the years after, the Fed's hoard of assets, mostly government IOUs, jumped from under $1 trillion to several times that. A side account that once looked like a footnote turned into one of the biggest books in global finance. That looks safe when interest rates are low, but what happens when the world moves out of that low-rate comfort zone? It looks very different when rates rise. As borrowing costs move up, the market value of old, low-rate bonds drops. Losses appear, not just at the central bank, but at any bank or fund that copied that safe strategy. In 2023, a few regional U.S. banks hit this wall. Higher yields crushed the value of their bond piles, the same bonds they had parked as rock solid. At one of those banks, executives watched screens as their safe bond portfolio bled red with every tiny jump in yields. Regulators stepped in and calmed things down, but the basic risk did not vanish. A lot of money is still parked in the same kinds of assets, on the assumption that rates can always be moved around without breaking anything important. Outside the U.S., the mood has shifted. For years, many foreign central banks kept a big chunk of their savings in American IOUs. Now some of them are cutting that share and spreading their bets. New reserves go not only into treasuries, but also into other major currencies and more gold. And that is why more central banks quietly add to their gold bars while still smiling at dollar meetings. Groups of countries are testing new ways to settle trade so they do not have to lean as hard on the dollar. Some big energy and commodity exporters have tried pricing parts of their exports in their own money or in regional units. None of this replaces the dollar overnight, but taken together, it shows a common view. Decisions made in America ripple through everyone else's backyard. When the Fed is in full support mode, buying a lot of bonds and holding borrowing costs down, money is easy worldwide, and price pressure tends to build, not just in America, but in other countries too. When it pulls back and lets yields rise, credit tightens and money often rushes out of weaker markets and back into U.S. assets. We have seen versions of this before in past cycles where higher U.S. rates and talk of less bond buying hit emerging economies that depended on foreign capital. If more countries slowly reduce how much they rely on U.S. IOUs and build their own backup plans, you will not see a single dramatic break. You will see small signs, bond sales that take more effort to complete, periods when interest rates stay higher than the local economy seems to justify, and moments when the Fed has to choose, do we protect the bond market or the value of the dollar in people's pockets? At some point, it may face a choice where saving one means hurting the other. At the same time, the dollar system itself has turned into a tool of pressure. Governments have seen reserves frozen, banks cut off from key messaging networks, and payments blocked. Somewhere, a finance minister has watched their country's rainy day fund vanish behind a login screen that suddenly will not open. Each time that happens, it sends the same message to finance ministers and central bankers: you need a way out if this switch is ever turned on you. So as the outside world quietly builds options, attitudes at home have been changing too. Over the last few decades, federal debt has climbed from what once looked like manageable levels into the tens of trillions, with the biggest jumps coming right after each major crisis. Borrowing spikes, the central bank's pile of government IOUs grows, the emergency passes. But the new, higher level of debt stays. The cost of paying interest eats up a larger share of tax income. Yet for most people, that risk has faded into background noise. The working assumption is simple. If the government needs more money, it will just borrow more and someone will buy the bonds. How long can a habit like that run before anyone seriously asks what happens if the someone blinks? The whole drama around the debt ceiling shows how far this mindset has gone. First, Congress agrees to spend the money. Only later does it stage a fight over whether to raise the legal cap that makes that spending possible. Each time, after loud arguments and threats, the ceiling is lifted or pushed aside. because too many banks, funds, pensions, and foreign governments are holding those IOUs and expecting to be paid on time. In practice, the limit has turned into a regular piece of theater about how worried to sound, not a hard stop on using this bond machine. All of this adds up to a simple problem. Right now, the system is very hard to unwind, because stopping it suddenly would hurt more, fast, than keeping it going a bit longer. Once a powerful country learns to fund itself with its own IOUs, there comes a point where that machine is tied into everything: jobs, housing, pensions, markets. At that point, no leader wants to be the one who pulls the plug. History has seen versions of this before. Spain kept feeding its empire with silver. Rome kept thinning the metal in its coins. The Soviet Union kept pouring money into a heavy industrial machine, long after it stopped paying for itself. Different tools, same pattern. Once a system leans on one trick, it hangs onto it past the point of safety. So what does that pattern look like in the United States right now? In the US today, budget gaps are normal. Year after year, the government spends more than it collects, and filling that hole with new bonds is the standard move, no matter who wins elections. The Fed holds a big slice of that debt and has stepped up its buying every time stress has hit. That has trained everyone to expect more support the next time things shake. Over time, that has shaped how assets are priced and how people borrow. House prices, stocks, company debt, and government plans are all built on the idea that lending to the state will stay cheap, and that rolling old debt into new debt will always be possible. Outside the country, some big holders have started to pull back a little, but they have not walked away. So the structure still rests on one thing: the belief that these IOUs will be honored. The one step we have not seen yet is a full loss of faith, a moment when lenders either demand much higher interest or decide they would rather not hold the paper at all. A country that borrows in its own money has more room than one that borrows in someone else's. It can always tell its central bank, "Create more units so we can pay." That avoids an official default. It does not make the cost disappear. It moves it. When more money is created to cover old promises, the pain shifts toward people who hold that money and toward people whose pay does not move quickly. Over time, prices of goods, services, and assets rise to reflect the extra money, but wages and savings accounts often lag behind. In practice, it works like a quiet transfer, away from savers and cash and toward borrowers whose debts are now paid back in money that buys less. When officials talk about these moves, they frame them as steps to stabilize markets. For ordinary people, they show up in very simple ways: rent that takes a bigger share of income, loans that cost more, and pay that does not stretch as far at the supermarket. A lot of this flows through one key price: the return on U.S. government bonds. Many contracts in the economy, mortgages, car loans, business credit, even some rents and pension promises are linked directly or indirectly to that number. When the Fed is buying a lot of bonds, the return falls and the price of many assets tends to rise. When it cuts back or sells, the return rises, credit tightens, and risky assets start to slip. That is why traders and big funds hang on every word from central bankers. Small hints in a speech can move those returns, and with them, the value of huge portfolios. The press conferences and carefully chosen phrases may look like theater, but underneath, they change how easy or hard it is for families and firms to borrow, roll over debt, and invest. Seen over a longer stretch of time, this faith in the system is not new. Other leading powers once believed their money would always be trusted. They saw their coin or paper as a shield against the costs of overreach. It worked until it did not. When belief finally cracked, the shift was fast compared to the slow buildup that came before. It is possible that new technology, huge global markets, and the dollar's central role will keep this setup going for many years, with only occasional shocks. It is also possible that those same features, the size, the speed, and the reach, will make any future turn in sentiment hit harder when it arrives. For you, the point is not to guess the exact day this changes. The point is to know what rides on it. This way of funding has paid for roads, research, paychecks, benefits, and security. It has helped build a global network of trade and investment. It has also left a lot of that wealth resting on beliefs about what future leaders and central bankers will do, instead of on fully settled bills. If you understand that, you can see how those beliefs show up in house prices, in job markets, and in the tone of political fights. At some point, the U.S. government may still be issuing bonds and having its own institutions buy them, while outside buyers are more cautious or insist on higher rewards. If that day comes, the cost of keeping this machine running will be harder to hide. It will be visible in living standards, in how secure work feels, and in the real strength of the money you're paid in.